Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Voice of Authority webinar, brought to you today by Montagu Evans. My name is Toby Fox, and I'm the Managing Director at 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. Our job is to keep our network of councils and developers and investors and their influencers and advisors connected. During coronavirus, we're doing that through a series of webinars that provide councils with a platform to discuss their ambitions, their challenges, their influences, and the issues of urgency that they face. Next week, we're going to be presenting 7 frontiers of council house building, revealing some genuinely new and interesting public sector approaches to boost the delivery of new homes. And we'll hear from Mike Ainsbury MP, the Shadow Minister for Housing and Planning. That's next Thursday at 11 AM, and you can register for it at www.thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. But this week, we're focused on council investment strategies. Now, Googling that phrase, I found links with titles like A Stretch Too Far, Council Commercial Investment, and Tested to Breaking Point, and Parliament to Probe Council's Dodgy Investment Strategies, and so on. And that reflects the findings of the Public Accounts Committee in July, which pointed out that 1, councils have spent 6.6 billion on commercial investment in the last 3 years, up 14 times on the previous 3 years. And 2, a total of 91% of the spending was financed by borrowing. The committee called for Treasury to comprehensively review the prudential borrowing framework and for MHCLG to publicly challenge risky behaviour, intervene where investments are outside the spirit of the prudential code, and improve transparency and data. But what is this risky behaviour? Tasked by government to find new sources of income, to deliver more homes, to provide better places, to improve services, and to respond to crises, often with little additional revenue support or even reduced support, councils are pursuing a wide range of investment strategies. At 3Fox, in our work with councils, we strive to focus on the positive, to shine a light on what's good, to share best practice. So today, we're going to look at different approaches to investment at 2 councils: investing in homes in Southwark with Cabinet Member for Housing Leo Pollack, and investing in stimulating regeneration in Brent with Cabinet Member for Regeneration, Property and Planning, Shama Tatler. We'll also get an overview of council investment strategies for yield from Kevin White, partner at consultant Montagu Evans, and SIPFA, head of asset management, David Bentley, has very kindly offered to give us the Institute's view. What a panel. And viewers, you lucky people, you get to ask their advice, their opinions and their comments through the Q&A function on your screens. And we'll turn to that following the presentations. We'll also be asking for your opinions and input with a series of polls throughout this session. So let's get the conversation going, turning first of all to Councillor Pollack. Leo, thank you for joining us today. What can you tell us about the political imperatives, the policy development, the practical actions and the outcomes delivered by Southwark's housing investment strategy?
So good morning, everyone, and thank you, Toby, for inviting me to join this conversation. I just have to say, having spent the morning with my 2-year-old, I do not feel like a voice of authority at all. Bear that in mind. I will speak about this issue, obviously, from kind of the perspective of housing investment in our borough. One of the key drivers for us in Southwark is to raise the quality of housing that we have in our borough and to meet the housing needs of our residents. At present, particularly exacerbated by the pandemic lockdown measures, the increase in unemployment, and the increase in homelessness presentations we've had. We've now got over 14,000 households on our council housing waiting list, over 3,000 children growing up in temporary accommodation in our borough, despite having one of the largest council house building programmes in the country and doing everything we can through the planning system to maximise the affordable housing that we secure. Around 6 years ago, we began a generational programme to build 11,000 council homes, and this was premised on what we felt was a sustainable approach to housing investment, replenishing the stock of housing, improving people's living conditions, and crucially meeting housing need. But of course, like all boroughs who are working hard to try and build council homes, Brent, we've got Shama here being one of them, certainly. we're challenged when it comes to the resources that are available to us, and also to the land that's available to us. Like most boroughs, we've had an initial focus on infill sites on existing council estates, and we're kind of blessed in Southwark for having a lot of council housing, 55,000 homes, 260 estates, and also to looking at different ways of doing resident-led estate redevelopment. We have a couple of projects on that front at the minute. But in order to really scale up this ambition and move meaningfully towards that stretch target of 11,000, which we've invested a huge amount in developing in-house delivery capacity for, we need to be building up a strategic land bank to carve out those sites where we can actually start delivering the kind of housing that our residents need. And it's to that this conversation focuses most heavily. We currently have 120 sites that we're active on, and there's a great variety of sites. I think you mentioned that event possibly next week, where I'll be discussing some of those strategies. But we're also buying new land to build new council housing, including significant large sites in the growth areas in our borough, as well as in other areas, windfall sites that we've identified. So there's a couple in Rotherhithe that we've already bought. There are a number of conversations we're having throughout the borough with different landowners, and this is all premised on the fact that ever since the housing revenue account debt cap was lifted, we're in a position where we have a greater debt envelope to work with. The main sites that we have acquired are large sites on the Old Kent Road. And I think the key thing that is worth kind of emphasising here is that when you have the extent of unaffordability and of overcrowding, the extent to which operating within a fundamentally broken housing economy, the wealth and generosity of your parents becomes one of the main factors for whether you have the housing and the subsequent opportunities in life. We have to ask a fundamental question about whether this housing economy is just a natural form of injustice and a form of necessary suffering, or whether we are absolutely serious about levelling up all parts of our society and meeting the housing needs of our borough. So when it comes to investing in housing, obviously there is a wider discussion around the kind of sites that we buy. Most of them have income generating uses on them already that exceed the debt financing cost. This is the key issue, and I'm really interested to hear what the other panelists have to say about the stability of that model, given the uncertainties certainly around commercial uses. But we've been relatively fortunate in the sites that we've acquired so far, and they've not been too heavily impacted by the pandemic lockdown in terms of footfall and spend. But I think the key thing I want to just focus on in this context of trying to build up that strategic land bank towards 11,000 council homes are three areas where I think the government could change their frame of reference, introduce new concepts, or actually reintroduce old concepts, and make this situation of land assembly much easier. Because at present, the land prices in Southwark and elsewhere in high value, high demand parts of Britain, certainly in London, are a great cap on having enough financial space for us to deliver the level of affordable housing and infrastructure contribution that should be the starting point for proper good growth in our borough. So the first thing is really around the extent to which the public accounts classify housing investment as an infrastructure item. So they're always classified in the whole of government accounts as a revenue item. This means that they're not calculating the economic multipliers that come from that additional construction activity. We know that construction, house building, for every pound that you spend, there's something like 2.8 pounds throughout the entire supply chain that is spent off the back of that. That's significant receipts back into the Treasury, significant savings also when you're delivering social housing on the benefit bills. If you just look at this as a narrowly financial equation and put to one side the fundamental health and well-being drivers of this, that's a really important area that needs to have a different approach. Other countries in Europe have better ways of modelling investment in public housing and are able to work towards much longer budget horizons. So that's the first piece. The second piece is around the land compensation regime that we're operating in. So Ever since 1961 and the Land Compensation Act, this has become a bit of a scratch record issue for many people on the Labour and Tory side of the discussion. But ever since then, the hope value, the speculative premium of any given site is enshrined in law, and that's reflected also in the RICS guidance that determines valuations of land. What that means in practice is that the sales price, the transactions, are often many multiples the actual real existing use value of a given site. So in our case in Southwark, certainly on the Old Kent Road, we have discrepancies sometimes in tens of millions. And that's, from my perspective, those are sums that should be going financially towards affordable housing, infrastructure contribution, maybe a little bit of profit for the landowner, and not much else. It's a dead weight loss in terms of actually delivering the outcomes we want through housing development. So we need to reform the Land Compensation Act. It's an urgent imperative. There was an emerging cross-party consensus until the current Prime Minister took over. You saw in the Letwin review on build-out rates that it was a key area of focus for ensuring that homes actually do get built rather than waiting for the market to catch up with an overheated land prices. So that's the second piece. And the third piece is just a wider question about how the flows of private money becoming public money through the tax system and then going back into housing generally. There's been a lot of effort to try and bring private equity and pension funds into house building. Much of the new policy around build to rent products is based on trying to enable that model. And there's been a sort of mix of pluses and minuses in terms of what that's delivered. But the fundamental issue is that we are in an economy that is highly financialized, where there is a culture of expectations of super high, super short-term returns on any kind of investment. And it's an toxic environment for investing in the fundamental bread and butter basics of housing investment that meets the needs of real-world residents in terms of their incomes. So we have also introduced a kind of the beginning, almost just to begin a conversation with the world of private finance, what we describe as a fixed rate housing standard in our strategy towards building 11,000 council homes that we adopted in our cabinet last April. And what that essentially is about is trying to find the sweet spot between private finance and public need to have a rate of return that is fixed in terms of the certainty rate over a given repayment period, and also fixed in terms of its link to the cost of public borrowing, because you don't want to be burdened with debt financing that is any greater than that of public borrowing. It may be a little pie in the sky, but we've put that out as a kind of opening gambit just to begin a conversation, because we know that there's billions out there in private equity and pension funds looking for very stable areas to park their money. There's nothing more stable than social housing, because the demand is limitless, really. We're so far from meeting it. So this is really just the beginning of that part of the conversation as well. So there's kind of three areas that I would hope government would try to influence. On the latter point in particular, I would like to see government try a lot harder in incentivising private money to become more affordable to public authorities who are serious about meeting housing need in their borough. So I'll leave it at that.
Who are you having that conversation with, Leo?
I wouldn't want to name names, but I think we know that there are lots of finance houses out there who are looking to set themselves up as registered providers and delivering social housing. At the minute, the main model that we see is just buying up Section 106 agreements and planning permissions, and being a kind of financial intermediary to delivering often temporary housing, which obviously has a better return in terms of being nearer to the LHA rate. But we're just beginning that conversation with different finance vehicles, and the door is wide open, because the key thing for us is to find that space in which we can deliver real additionality beyond the limits that the grant level and HRA borrowing limits impose on us at present.
Fantastic.
grant and prudential borrowing is always the number one.
But the point I was trying to make, that's a one-to-one conversation you're having with individual institutions. That's not a sort of sector-wide conversation you're having in some sense.
We're not well placed to organise a sector-wide conversation, but we've set this down as a standard in order to make it really clear what our objectives are. Our explicit mission in Southwark's New Homes programme is to maximise the proportion of genuinely affordable social housing as far as the project and programme viability allows. And this is just at the beginning of the conversation to see to what extent we can open up a bigger finance pool to draw upon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Pollack. So viewers, lots to get your teeth into just from that first presentation. Housing as infrastructure, not revenue in the public accounts, the whole concept of land compensation, and the toxic investment ecosystem, and perhaps the idea of introducing a fixed rate of return on housing to overcome that. Great stuff. Councillor Tatler, Shama, thank you so much for joining us today, and for sparing the time in what I know is the busiest time for local authorities everywhere. What can you tell us about the political imperatives, the policy development, the practical actions and the outcomes delivered by Brent's strategy of investing to accelerate and support regeneration, particularly in Wembley?
Yeah, thank you. So thanks everyone and welcome, and thanks for having me on this morning. So I'll give a bit of context about Brent as a borough. So we're situated in the northwest of London. Wembley is central to the borough, and if anyone's been there recently, you'll see how much is going on. Probably had around £2 billion worth of investment and growing in the Wembley Park area. So it's a huge area of regeneration for us. Which started as a result of our own planning policy as a Wembley area action area. So it's a kind of council-led planning policy that's resulted in that sort of investment. Brent as a borough, we have Kilburn to the south and border Westminster and Camden. Right up to the north will be border Ealing, Harrow and Barnet. 149 languages are spoken in borough. In Brent, we're one of the most diverse boroughs in London, hence we're the Borough of Culture this year, although that's sort of been hijacked. Well, we're not doing as much as we were anticipating to do. And I think some of the things that's really worth noting is that we have over 14,000 SMEs in the borough. Obviously, our proximity to Heathrow means that we have a lot of employment supply chains directly linked to the aviation industry. Park Royal being one of the biggest industrial sites in Europe is also we share with Ealing. 19 town centres, and I think it's really important that any investment strategy that we have is based around social needs. So one of our key indicators is wage of our residents. So on average, our wage is £36,000 a year, which isn't great for London, but actually in parts of our borough, it goes down to £18,000 a year. So there is a huge issue around inequality, wage, salaries and wages and skills as well, part of the regen brief. So as part of our investment strategy around regen, place and housing generally, it's really about investing in people and the social outcomes. I think that's our driver. Revenue impact and how we measure return is not measured in result of short-term gains. It's really long-term investment. And when we're not measuring by percentages of what we get back in the same way that probably the private sector does. So our measurements are on outcomes for residents, about upskilling, about jobs, about quality of life, and that kind of well-being aspect, which is really important to actually, I think, growth. And one of the key things that we've done recently is look at how we enable residents in Brent to participate and benefit from the huge growth that's happening across Brent. I mean, if you go anywhere around the borough, you'll be seeing cranes everywhere. I think there's an anecdote that one Christmas we caused a crane shortage because there was so much going on in the borough. And so we've developed an inclusive growth strategy that looks at the next 20 years and potentially what levers we can pull to local authority, and also what we need to do in partnership with other public sector partners or the private sector to enable our residents to benefit from potential growth that's coming to Brent. So the council in the year 2018 to 19, we had a capital investment of around £150 million, which is going to set to grow to around 261 million, largely over the next year, largely driven by regen projects across the borough, and not just housing. Obviously, housing is a huge part of that investment, And a lot of our housing is done through the HRA account, but we're also doing some through our capital account. But we're also using housing investment to really look at what is directly benefiting Brent residents. And that's, we don't play to make money off this. It is about actually residents' well-being and lifestyle and opportunity residents. Some things that we're doing. So we've purchased directly built homes from big developers. So we've bought some from St George's, from Telford Homes in South Kilburn, to enable us to have key worker housing. So not just social housing that we want to bring forward, but key worker housing, which is actually a real need for us in terms of the civic centre, in terms of social workers, planners, building regs officers that we all desperately need within our network in the borough. So that's one of the things that we're doing. We're also really committed to investing in areas like Stonebridge and Harlesden, where we have investment is massively needed. We're bordering the OPDC area. That's bringing its own investment, but we need to make sure that the bordering areas of Brent benefit from that. So our capital investment. So one example, Moorland Gardens, we've committed to around 45 million in capital, including 15 million from SIL to provide a mixed development of affordable housing or social housing, as well as a brand new enterprise and employment adult education centre in the heart of Stonebridge, which is where the need is going to be greatest. I should also point out that we've got Brent Central alone has 42,000 residents in furlough at the moment, and we are desperately worried about the cliff edge that's coming in terms of employment numbers. We've also created a Harlesden investment framework. So part of our capital investment is looking at where we need to invest the most. So Harlesden town and the ward is one of our most deprived wards, and it needs investment. So we've gone out and purchased from Wetherspoons, the Picture Palace pub. It's a huge site in the middle of Harlesden town centre. We're refurbing it. It's out to tender at the moment, but we're actually going to use it not for housing, but actually help regenerate and make the high street productive, but turn it into an affordable workspace, community centre, active usage within the town centre. We're not looking to make any money out of this, but it's about embracing the town centre that needs footfall to increase. And actually, it's come about from what residents have asked us, saying that we need more community space, we need more space for young people to congregate and maybe divert them from things like crime or antisocial behaviour. We're also working with other agencies. So we're working with Heritage England, and we've recently put about £1 million we've got to promote and look at improving the conservation areas in our town centres, Harlesden being one of them. So that piece of work is about to start. And we're doing some significant investment in estate regeneration, so South Kilburn being our biggest at the moment. And we're not just building housing, we're using still to build a new medical centre, a new primary school, and we're using housing infrastructure fund to completely change the infrastructure of transport around there. And our civic centre, it's 90 million it cost us originally, but it's bringing 14 other buildings into one building. And it sets the scale. If you've ever been to Brent and you've seen our civic centre, it sets a vision for our ambition really about what we want for our borough. But in itself has saved us a load of money, but it's made our working better. So investment is actually how we can be more efficient. And finally, our investment strategy is not just about housing and regeneration in terms of physical buildings. It's also about things that you can't see. So we've invested 12 million into, probably near 20 now, into our digital strategy. So improving digital access for our residents, and in itself that will be a cost saving for us as a council. Also, it's again part of that improving life chances of our residents. We're using not the biggest media players, but actually some of the smaller internet providers to actually maybe slightly disrupt the market, if you will, but they're going to be providing our housing estates with broadband and Wi-Fi and fibre optic on our housing estate at much cheaper level than the bigger players would do. And we've got a contract with 2 providers to be able to do that for our housing estates, because it's very important. And I think COVID has shown that digital poverty is a real thing, particularly in London and pockets of London. So our investment strategy looks at how we can upskill residents and make sure they've got the access they need if they can't go to school, if they need upskilling in terms of education for their own employment opportunities. So it is about investing in things that perhaps aren't solid infrastructure, but things that will perhaps pay dividends 20, 30 years time. Because I think our view at Brent is that we're not in, it's unique as a public sector body. We're able to manage, we can disrupt a marketplace by saying we don't need to have profit built in short term. We can look at it long term and invest in that way. And the way that we do that is obviously borrowing our own capital. We've been, as difficult as it's been for local authorities, we've taken some decisions, and I think, and I'll say this politically because I can, I think Labour councils have been better at managing local authority funding than other councils have, and we're particularly in London, we're I think more in a strengthened position to invest our capital to do that. And we're also very good at collecting our SIL. So we're using SIL to be able to fund some of this infrastructure. And we're taking the opportunity now where in the current market, some of the big developers are building out their Section 106 obligations in terms of affordable housing, affordable workspace. And now we're using our ability to access funding to buy it from them. So we have control over that for our residents. And similar to Leo, we have huge housing need, we have huge skills needs, we have employment needs. And so it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we're as much of a player in the market as the private sector is.
Fantastic. Shama, thank you very much indeed. That's exactly what we wanted, a completely different sort of perspective on councils investing. And we've got viewers, we're looking forward to your questions shortly. We've got themes of long-term investment with social returns rather than financial returns, and outcomes like improved quality of life, improved well-being. We've got investing in key worker housing, investing in community spaces, investing in social infrastructure like medical facilities and transport, and also digital infrastructure. So some great themes there. Kevin, turning to you and Montagu Evans, I know I'm looking forward to one of the now renowned Montagu Evans slideshows, but it would be great if you could, so I know you've got a pre-prepared presentation, but it would be great if you could also talk a little around the two sort of, I guess, the uncovered subjects yet, which are the commercial property side of council investments and investing for yield. If you could give us a little perspective on that from your experience nationally, that would be terrific. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, of course. You're right. I mean, it'd be wrong of me not to have prepared a little slide deck because it's, we are consultants after all. But I think it is important. Just before we started, Toby said to all of us, we're here as the voice of authority. So, I mean, yes, I'm a consultant, but I'm here effectively representing the 100 or so local authorities that we work with. And I'm fortunate enough to sit and advise a lot of their property investment boards. And it is challenging. So I'll cover as much of that as I can in a short time so that we can start to talk about some of the things that have come up, because it's a huge topic. So what do we know? Property investment is bad. There's lots of stats around this, but this is effectively this almost received wisdom in council worlds that somehow councils aren't the right people to be doing this and that they don't know what they're doing. And some of the stats that sit around this is about how big councils are spending. And Toby mentioned at the start, there's 6.6 billion over 2016 to 2019. It means that councils now make up something like 3% of the total UK investment market. Spent over £2 billion, 2018 and 2019. And you hear some stories about some serious debt balloons, 100 times net revenue budgets in some instances. So not unreasonably, we've seen government and its agencies say, hold a sec, this is a bit wrong. So I'll let David talk about the Sit for Prudential Code. But last October, we saw 1% hike on all borrowing through Public Works Loan Board. That hit everything. That hit things like housing. It would have affected what Leo and Shama are talking about. Then in February, you had the NAO's third investigation they made, and it looked at some of the sheer scale of what was going on. Last financial year, MHCLG said this approach to MRP, which for those that don't know, in shortest order is effectively just being able to account for paying back the principal debt over the course of the loan. They've tightened the rules around that. And we've got the Public Accounts Committee, of course, which MHCLG are yet to respond to. And finally, the Public Works Loan Board consultation, which Rishi announced in the spring budget. That's effectively going to prevent councils accessing PWRB specifically for yield. And some of the reasons around that are some of the sort of bad news stories in effect. So this graph is a little complicated, not going to dwell on it, but in effect it shows the impacts that council borrowing has on localized markets. So you can see there that a few of them, we've got well over a quarter of all acquisitions over the last 3 years have been made by local authorities. And that can skew things. But what's really important is not to forget that 80% of activity is carried out by less than 14% of local authorities. So there is this question, are some of the tightening, some of the things that we're seeing through government, is this just to stop a few bad apples, but actually spoiling the whole batch? I don't think it's a systemic failure. I think there is a narrative here. And this is kind of it. Council spending power is falling. The Institute for Local Government says 18% up to 2019, and I reckon it's much higher, 28.6%. So that's having a knock-on effect. We can't fund the services, and that's really quite challenging for all councils. So this idea of trying to generate some income is deathly important. And the LGA reckons that we're £6.5 billion funding gap by 2025. They did this in March, so that's getting ever bigger with every moment that goes on with this COVID crisis. And there's this fundamental problem that it's more demand for services, less money to deliver them. And there are a bunch of reasons why councils do this investment activity. We've heard from councillors, from Councillor Pollock, sorry, about regeneration and housing. Councillor Tatler on the same sort of concepts. Other councils now looking at infrastructure investments, and actually Councillor Tatler touched on some of this, and it could be broadband and fibre, sorting out digital outcomes. But increasingly now it's about green infrastructure and how we can sort of marry some of those long-term income plays that Councillor Pollock talked about with some proper outcomes that can also be financially viable. I'm going to talk about income because it's the most controversial, and everyone else has got more exciting things to talk about. But one of the big things that sits around income that is controversial is this notion of out of borough. But many councils do face really quite a severe problem. And it's some of these things that we rehearse with councils up and down the country. If you're a rural economy or a small economy, or you need to acquire land for homes, and Councillor Pollock touched on this, but the existing use value or even the hope value is so much higher. Well, what do? You can't square that circle. You can't really start to deliver things. So is it, and this is a question that's deliberated up and down the country on property investment boards for councils, is it necessarily wrong to say, we need money, let's go out, let's find some secure income, and then let's recycle that money back into local economy to start to deliver some of these things? I mean, honestly, the rules basically say yes, it is, as I'm sure David's going to touch on very shortly. But what we think is, and we do lots of work with CIPFA and the LGA about trying to upskill councillors and officers around this, is that if you're going to do it, at least do it safely. And there's lots of ways that you can think about those sorts of things. And we reckon that there are really 6 things that need to be focused upon. And it's this idea of a risk appropriate strategy. So build a strategy and an investment strategy that is inclusive. It's proactive, it's not reactive, it's not just driven by the member for finance saying, Christ, we're really stuck here. It includes members, it's aligned with the corporate objectives, and fundamentally is risk appropriate. It needs to be proportionate. So these 100 times net revenue account debt balloons are not proportionate. You need to think about the long-term effects of this and upskilling and outsourcing some of the things that councils have. You are now a huge player in the market, and that means that you need lots of skills. Don't be afraid to ask for help. The outstanding governance point is absolutely key. So over the number of years that we've been doing this sort of stuff with councils, the governance has got better and better and better. That's not to say that it's perfect all over the shop, and indeed that's one of the big takeaways from the Public Accounts Committee's inquiry and from the NEO's views. Make sure we take a long-term view. This is the proactive argument, really. We need to make sure that what councils are doing is in the context of long-term capital strategy and the medium-term financial strategy, making sure that what's been done is proactive, it's long-term, and key is just not to be like this, not to ignore everything. So that's the view from our side for basically councils that we're working with.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. David, in particular, we'd be really interested to hear what CIPFA's views are in response to the Public Accounts Committee's findings.
Okay, good morning. Hello from a not so sunny Derbyshire. I wish that was the behind me. I wish it was the view outside my window, but it's not. But it's a lot better than a messy office. So so excuse me for that. Okay, just to set a few things in context. First of all, I'm not an accountant. I'm a quantity surveyor by trade. So please don't ask any technical accountancy questions. I can give the SIPFA view, but I mainly work in strategic asset management. So I'm going to try and cover both areas. One probably better than the other, to be honest. So I'll let you guess which one I know a bit more about after the sort of 5 minutes or 10 minutes. Okay, first of all, I think we need to start by thinking about the Prudential Code. When the Prudential Code came in back in about 2004, 2005, it was a breath of fresh air. Before that, I know as a quantity surveyor, in the end of March, I'd be running around building sites, valuing pieces of work, because we needed to spend money quickly and we needed to spend money by the end of the financial year. And it was silly. We had some ridiculous decisions going on. And the Prudential Code came in and basically it said to councils, be sensible. Just borrow money where you need it, and be prudent and sensible about the way you borrow that money. It was never really envisaged for what we're seeing as a result of the since 2010, the squeeze on finances within local government and the resultant investment that we've seen. It's fair to say that that investment, as Kevin rightly said, some of the extreme investment is just one or two councils, and maybe that's got the headlines and everybody thinks everybody's doing it, but that's not the case. It is just a few extremes. So the Prudential Code was reviewed a couple of years ago, and it's due to be reviewed imminently again. And that review will probably stretch over the next 12 months. Consultation, I understand, will go out early in the new year. And we would welcome all authorities to contribute to that. And I think the more views, the better for that. Last time it went out to consultation, there were 2 rounds of consultation just because of the amount of information we got back. So please contribute. The likely publication for the new Prudential Code is towards the end of 2021, but it might be delayed depending on that consultation time. As Kevin mentioned, the Public Works Loan Board are now withholding funding for anything that's regarded as pure investment. And they are carrying out some consultation which commenced over the summer and waiting for responses to that. The response date was actually extended because of COVID. But the consultation is interesting, and it says a few things that I think are worth just focusing on. So the government proposes, this is verbatim from that consultation. The government proposes ending access to PWLB for local authorities that wish to buy commercial assets primarily for yield, as assessed by the statutory section 151 officer of the local authority against guidance developed through this consultation. Local authorities that wish to buy commercial assets primarily for yield would remain free to do so, but would not be able to take out new loans from PWLB in that financial year. Any loans taken out under the old system would not be affected by this change. And later on, they talk about asking local authorities who wish to borrow from PWLB to provide a high-level outline of their capital plans for the year or for future years ahead, including assurance from the finance director that the local authority is not borrowing in advance of need and does not intend to buy commercial assets primarily for yield. And at that point about primarily for yield is important, because a lot of people confuse what investment is. And the councillors in their presentation have talked about investing in regeneration, investing in housing. Now that is different to investing purely for an income. And that's where the government has an issue. And that's probably where SIPFA in the Prudential Code has an issue. The position with SIPFA is that local authorities shouldn't borrow purely for investment that provides a yield. It should, if we're borrowing, then there should be other social value reasons, as was previously said by the councillors. And in fact, there are opportunities that some local authorities are looking for that investment for yield without maybe looking closer to home. Local authorities hold a lot of assets that we class as, we use the abbreviation TNRP, tenanted non-residential property, where they have tenancies in and they have been held for a number of years. And the reasons for holding these are often lots of varying social reasons. They could be for regeneration. They could be trying to encourage footfall in a high street. They could be encouraging community organisations to get together and be sustainable. And many local authorities haven't actually challenged the use of those assets for a number of years. So, for example, a Nottinghamshire authority that we worked with a couple of years ago had a lot of industrial units that were set up after the mine shut. And we said to them, are the reasons for job creation that they were originally acquired for still valid? And they said, well, we haven't reviewed it for 20 odd years. And so they reviewed that and they realized that some of those assets were really no longer serving the original purpose that they were acquired for. And so that there is really a need for local authorities to look internally before we look externally, and maybe get our own house in order about what we've got and the money we're getting in from it, and whether those social value reasons are still being achieved. So there's that in itself. Now, when it comes to investment or property, we need to ask ourselves 3 questions. Can we acquire commercial property? What are the rules around it? Should we acquire it? And will we actually do so? And there needs to be a process that's gone through. Now, legally, obviously, there's nothing to stop you, but although now PWLB are putting the shutters up on borrowing to invest. If it's your own money, then it's about prudent use of that money with a full business case and understanding of the consequences. And this needs to be set against an investment strategy, as Kevin said earlier, and also a wider capital strategy and asset management plan. And it's important that we do this at a strategic level and balance areas like regeneration against housing need as well. And this needs to be a strategic and a corporate approach. And what we're finding in a number of local authorities that we look at is that they are seeing the investments as a way to get money in without really setting that against their strategic policy and strategy and balancing it against regeneration, housing, and all of the other aspects and all the buildings that they've got at the moment. So this needs to be a whole package. The investment strategy needs to be set against those other things and balanced against those other things. Instead of maybe acquiring assets just purely for investment, we should look at our TNRP, we should look at the wider picture and produce a strategy based on that. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, David. You can see the sort of threads that might come out of that in terms of strategies going forward. And we've got some questions coming in from the viewers. You've sparked them into action, panel. Well done. Thank you, viewers. Emma Rosser, Southwark, Brent, and councils that Montagu Evans work with, how are they changing their property investment plans? How are you changing your property investment plans in response to the PWLB restrictions on debt for yield? Let's go round the circle in the same order that we did previously. Councillor Pollack, Leo, is PWLB restrictions, is that going to change your housing investment programme?
I don't think so. I'm not I don't think I have enough authority really to speak on that. I think our section 151 officer would be a better place to answer that than me. But I think our approach has always been that the investments that have been made in Southwark, and they are in Southwark, they're internal and they're also focused on regeneration as well. So I talked about sites that we buy for housing, but there's also sites that are housing and a potential secondary school, a reserve sites that we're reserving for the extension of the Bakerloo line down the Old Kent Road. So generally that has been the approach. And I think kind of the outline that David was just describing there, we would be kind of Kipfer's pet on the kind of criteria that he was setting out. So I don't think we would have to respond that greatly to the consultation. We're currently developing an investment strategy of the kind that David is talking about, just to kind of formalise the rationale for our investments a bit more clearly. So, yeah.
Thanks, Councillor. Shama, what about you? Do PLWB restrictions, they changed your sort of investment programme in Wembley and wider Brent? Oh, you're on mute, Councillor. Sorry.
Apologies. So no, politically, no, it hasn't. Our need is still there. So we've tasked officers to find other avenues to bring the income in to enable us to continue our work on that. So we are, obviously we've campaigned about particularly the percentage increase on borrowing at PW, on the Public Works Loan Board borrowing. But we are looking at other investment borrowing capabilities. So our Section 151 officer and the head of finance have gone away and been tasked at looking at opportunities that we can borrow or seek investment from the private sector that can help us carry out the ambitions of our housing, particularly our housing programme, which does yield some return. And if we can get it on a similar or probably cheaper rate than the public loan, then we'll do so. We're trialing out on smaller amounts at first to see how it goes. But our ambition in terms of politically, in terms of making sure that our investments continue, particularly in housing, are not thwarted by what the Public Loan Works Board are doing.
Great stuff. Thanks very much. Kevin, I'm going to put the same question to you, and if you could give us a sort of overview of the local authorities you're working for, how PLWB changes have affected investment strategies, but also there are a number of questions coming in on different aspects of out of borough investment. So what's the etiquette? What's the sort of governance around out of borough investment? Do you feel that it's been justified, out of borough investment is justified to diversify the portfolio and reduce risk? And a number of other questions on that. What's your experience of out of borough investment at the moment, Kevin?
I'll just briefly tackle the PWLB one first, if that's okay. It honestly depends on the maturity of the council's investment strategy. So for the purposes of sort of, I guess, debate, I've been trying to focus on yield, but all of the commercial investment strategies sit as part of a much wider capital strategy and medium-term financial plan. So the changes in PWLB, and certainly when the consultation opens, that precipitated almost all the councils that we work with to start to do a bit of head scratching, and that head scratching for most is still going on, trying to work out just how they deal with that. There are alternative sources of finance, as Shama says. The municipal bonds agency is one. There are various sorts of long income options for councils, a bit. So Councillor Pollack was alluding to it, but those sort of things where you start to try and marry the long-term imperatives of pension income and the ESG agenda with delivering housing and delivering social infrastructure, those sorts of things. There is actually potentially a bit of a alignment of interests there. But to tackle that issue about out of borough, as I tried to get across in the presentation, the problem is that it's different for different councils. It's very, very challenging for some councils to be able to generate some degree of reasonable, appropriate, risk-appropriate return in their boroughs. So they need to augment that with with effectively looking out of borough to support some of that. You've got to bear in mind that the borough boundaries aren't absolutes. So this isn't a council that we work with, but South Cambridgeshire, for example, always talk about their area of influence, economic influence, because it's not as though your residents suddenly get to the edge of the borough and then fall off a cliff. There is the sort of social infrastructure and social value that sits around all of those things as well. So to bring this to a head, the out of borough thing only really works if it's part of a much wider strategy. It's not the answer. And I think the problem is that because it's quite a complex topic in general, as we've discussed on this panel so far, we could have done 15 of these, all on very separate but minutiae issues, that it's much easier to just say, isn't this bad? And the truth is it's incredibly nuanced. Most councils are really very well governed. They're taking a very sensible approach to things. And it is part of a wider corporate, commercial, proactive strategy.
Thanks, Kevin. David, are you able to comment on that? On the, I guess I speak as a layman in these things always, so forgive me if I'm being overly naive. But I guess one of the issues here is that if you're investing out of borough, can you really justify that in terms of not investing for yield? You know, are you just automatically contravening the government's guidelines?
I'll come on to that. I'll just comment on the 1% increase and also COVID in what that's done with borrowing or at least buying investment assets. Figures from MHCLG or recent figures reckon that council investment in buying buildings has dropped by about 56% between April and June this year compared to the similar period last year. So obviously COVID's having an effect. And we ran a poll of our property network and 60 authorities responded. And we asked them if the future uncertainty around COVID in the property market was affecting their approach to investment. And Kevin might want to comment on this. And most of about a third of them said, yeah, we still intend to invest, but we're going to be much more cautious about it. Only 15% said it hadn't changed their approach at all or their thinking at all. And some had said we've stopped all plans for investment until we know what's happening. So I think that PWLB, the 1%, has actually affected some authorities' choice in what they will invest in, whether they will invest. But I think COVID has probably had more of an effect overall in recent months. On the subject of out of borough investments, personally, I as a property professional, I'm obviously very sympathetic to that, and you'd have a balanced portfolio of property and regional variations and all that kind of stuff to build up a sustainable portfolio. But clearly, from a government point of view and a CIPFA point of view, if you are borrowing for out of borough acquisitions, then usually they would be primarily for yield, and it would be difficult to justify that. Obviously, if it's your own money, then that's a different kettle of fish and based on sound business cases.
Great stuff, David. Thanks. Shama, you wanted to come into that, and Kevin, I'll come back to you shortly.
Yeah, I think the only point I'd make, I think, practically and operationally, borrowing to buy our borough is possible, but I think there's an element that we also need to acknowledge that there is a relationship between the two councils. So if you're looking to invest in another borough, what is the relationship between your authority and that authority that you're buying in? Because actually it can cause a point of tension, particularly depending on the financial stability of the authorities involved. So London councils tend to have a little bit more buying power than out of London council. So there is that tension of London buying up places elsewhere, particularly if it's example of housing. So there is that relationship management element of it, and I think that's really important that we, as part of the decision-making process, that's considered, because you don't want to be kind of annoying a neighbour or a neighbouring or another authority. We wouldn't like it if somebody came to Brent and bought up a commercial property and made money from it when actually we could do it ourselves. So I think there's an element of that conversation that needs to be had in part of the decision making.
Lee, I'm gonna bring that straight back to you, because we've been having regular dinners with cabinet members for housing for 3 or 4 years now, with ourselves and Mike Diath at HTA, and this is a regular point of contention, isn't it? It's been happening within London for years and years and years, and now it's happening beyond. What you're on mute at the moment, but when you unmute, what would your comments be?
I've got a similar attitude to Shama. I think having an absolute prohibition on any out of borough investment cuts across, boroughs are quite artificial constructions, he says, in the greatest borough of them all, of course. But I think the relationship is absolutely key. I can kind of give a couple of examples, sort of looking at both sides of the coin. So just a kind of historic peculiarity, I don't know the origins of it, but the Strathclyde Pension Fund owned quite a large industrial site, industrial park and now development site on the Old Kent Road. And they are obviously accountable to Glasgow City Council and I think some other councils up in that part of the country. And they were just taking a pure commercial return on their investment. There was little scope for conversation about trying to meet more housing need, go beyond the minimum of planning policy requirements on affordable housing, and having any kind of connection to the needs of people up in Glasgow, the connection to people here in Southwark. So that was kind of one end of being on the receiving end of that, albeit with a history that goes back, I think, decades, probably. And the other piece to it as well is, as Shama said, I think some of the central and inner London boroughs have been able to get a march on setting themselves up as house builders in their own right, and also have a variety of different kinds of housing need that need to be met that can't necessarily be met on their own land, because land is at a premium. There's only so many sites you can allocate, short of constantly redeveloping the borough every generation. So I think there is a reasonable case to begin a conversation between inner London boroughs and outer London boroughs to see where there's opportunities for joint investment. But the relationship, as Shama says, is absolutely right. And I think the question is, if it's debt for yield, it's always about yield for what? And I think it's always got to be within the frame of a clear investment strategy that is focusing on the core objectives of the council, meeting the needs of the residents, meeting housing need, promoting health and well-being, developing good neighbourhoods and places. So I think that those are the kind of fundamentals. Yeah. And I would hope that's the kind of answer that comes out of the consultation.
Good points, Leo. Thank you very much. And as Chris Gill wisely points out, a number of local authorities are investing cross boundary because they're acting as combined authorities or across a LEP or an enterprise zone and so on. So presumably the relationships within those sorts of structures would be key, and that's to what you were both saying, Leo and Shama. Kevin, I'm gonna hand that back to you to comment on, and also perhaps you'd like to pick up on the kind of COVID effects that David mentioned, the huge drop in sort of investment activity over the last few months.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's heartening to know that councils have told CIPFA that they're not investing because of COVID, because the councils are no different in terms of those investment activities as the private sector is. So quite rightly so, in uncertainty, what do? Councils that are investing tend to be looking at it for very low risk, very long-term aspirations to try and support their capital strategies and medium-term financial strategies. So I'm generally not surprised that it's that low, and I'm actually surprised it's not lower, to be frank. I mean, it's a big old topic, isn't it? But I think that we're going to see councils having to invest a bit, honestly, just to make it part of how their funding structure works. I mean, what we aren't really addressing particularly, because it's such a huge topic, is the drive towards this. The drive towards this because 10 years of austerity, most councils that you talk to describe being cut to the bone and then saying through the bone. There isn't enough money to go around. There's too much pressure on services. They've been told to commercialise, and some have taken a much more giant leap than others down that particular road. So I think, Councillor Pollock talked earlier about some of the things that can fix issues with delivering housing around CPO and land values and the approaches that government can take. The same thing applies here, really. The answer is not just to say you cannot invest. It doesn't solve the problem. It just moves it somewhere else. And so I think that's really the conversation that needs to be had at government level around all of this kind of stuff, is to say, well, what is a logical, sensible solution to local authority funding?
Fantastic, Kevin. Thanks very much. Your answer itself and the whole discussion today is really, it's asked more questions than it's answered, because, as you say, it's such a big topic. I mean, just looking at the drivers, the income needs of local authorities from the sort of last 10 years of reshaping their income streams, the pressure on services there, that alone is an interesting topic for discussion. And also COVID. I mean, I would guess that investment hasn't gone down quite so much by local authorities as it has in the private sector, partly because needs have increased. You know, the need for social housing alone is increased. The need to deal with homelessness has probably led to some investment activity, and the supporting of high streets, which we barely touched on. I feel that there are more webinars coming, but Kevin, I'm going to have to let you have had the last word, because I say this every week, but every week it's true. An hour has just flashed by, and we've got to let our audience get back to work and put some of the learning that they've got today into action. And what a lot of learning. Panel, you've been magnificent in helping us balance the PAC findings and sharing with us what makes a good investment strategy from a number of different perspectives. And while our viewers rush off to convene investment committees on their behalf, I'll take this opportunity to thank you, Leo Pollack, Councillor Leo Pollack, I beg your pardon, of Southwark Council. Thank you, Councillor Shama Tatler of Brent Council, and thank you, David Bentley of SIPFA, and of course thank you, Kevin White at Montagu Evans, without whose support none of this would have happened. And as ever, most of all, thanks to you, our Voice of Authority viewers. We've got a raft of questions from you left hanging, but I'm going to put those to the panel by email after this, and hopefully be able to circulate their answers back to you via social media channels, and we'll let you know how to access their responses. We'll be back in a week with Shadow Minister for Housing and Planning, Mike Ainsbury MP, and a discussion of 7 frontiers of council house building. And you can register for that and watch the video of this session and all our other webinars at www.thevoiceofauthority.co.uk. If you'd like to get involved in these sessions, if today's session has sparked some ideas in you, and you'd like to get involved as a sponsor or as a speaker, please email me, toby@3fox.co.uk. Meanwhile, from our panel, from me, and from everyone at 3Fox, good afternoon.